The day I no longer had money to help my child, I no longer had a place in their plans. Not because my children are bad, but because they had grown used to their parents always giving. If it were you, would you keep sacrificing to preserve the title of family or accept loneliness for a while to protect your self-respect? I did not choose the path people expected, and that choice is what made the truth surface. If you are exhausted from always being the strongest one in your family, stay. This story may be the words you need to hear. I stood in front of Evelyn's door wearing clothes that had seen better days. The gray coat was frayed at the cuffs, my low heels were peeling at the soles, and my hair was no longer neatly arranged as it usually was. The reflection in the glass panel by the door made me pause for a second. The woman looking back at me appeared tired, older than her age. No one would have guessed that just a few days earlier, I had still been living in a spacious apartment overlooking the river. I rang the doorbell. Evelyn opened the door just wide enough to look out. Her eyes paused on me, quick, cautious. She recognized me. I knew that. But her reaction was neither surprise nor concern. It was the familiar guardedness of someone who always has to maintain an image. "Mom," Evelyn lowered her voice, "this isn't really a good time. The neighbors tend to notice. You understand?" She added a few more sentences, circling around how the house was busy, about upcoming engagements, about things that had nothing to do with me. I didn't blame her. I just stood there, listening, nodding. When the door closed, there was no slam, just a gentle movement. Enough for me to understand that I should not stay. I walked a little farther to Thomas's house. My son opened the door more quickly. He looked me up and down, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, before turning into calculation. Thomas didn't say much. He pulled out his wallet, handed me some cash, told me I should find a temporary place to stay, then said he had an early surgery and couldn't have me there. I took the money, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to observe my child's reaction more closely. Thomas had already turned back inside before I could say anything else. 2 doors had closed. I didn't feel angry. There was only a hollow space spreading through my chest, slow and cold. I continued on to the small house where Noah and Anna lived. When the door opened, Anna stood there. She looked at me, froze for a second, then stepped forward and took my hand. She didn't ask who I was first. She didn't ask what had happened. She said, "Come inside, it's cold out here." Noah came out from inside and pulled out a chair for me. He asked if I was tired, if I was hungry, and if I wanted some water first. No one asked why I had lost everything. No one glanced outside to see if anyone was watching. I sat there, on an old chair, in a small room warmed by the lingering scent of an unfinished dinner. At that moment, I knew I was hurting, but I also told myself, just as I had believed for a long time, that when the mind is not yet calm, it is not the time to draw conclusions. That night, after Anna had prepared a proper place for me to rest and Noah had gone back to the kitchen to finish the meal, I sat alone and looked around the small room. There was nothing remarkable about it. Everything was simple enough, and it was precisely that sense of enough that made me reflect more deeply on the life I had lived. I had spent nearly 40 years building my company. The early years were tough. I worked constantly, leaving early and coming home late, exhausted but never allowing myself to stop. When I had children, I told myself that everything I did was for them. I didn't want my children to worry about money the way I had when I was young, and I succeeded. My children studied at good schools, lived in safe neighborhoods, and never had to worry about overdue bills. Whenever they ran into trouble, I used money to fix it. When Evelyn was unhappy because she couldn't fit in with her classmates, I transferred her to another school. When Thomas worried about tuition, I paid everything in advance. Whenever a problem arose, I always said the same familiar line, "Let Mom handle it." At the time, I believed I was doing the right thing. I spared neither effort nor money. I never regretted those years of relentless work. I knew I had given my children a solid foundation. But sitting in Noah's small house, I began to see a gap I had long avoided. I had taught my children how to move forward, how not to let themselves lack anything. I taught them to be strong, to stand on their own. But I was no longer sure I had taught them enough about how to stay when someone else grows weak. I realized that every time I used money to solve a problem, I also unintentionally shortened the time I was truly present. I replaced presence with convenience. I believed that as long as everything was taken care of, love was complete. There were evenings when I didn't eat with my children because of work. There were times I promised to listen to their stories, only to answer a phone call halfway through. I compensated with gifts, trips, and things that could be bought. I don't condemn myself harshly. I did my best within the limits of my understanding at the time. But I also cannot deny one obvious truth now standing before me. Had I used money in place of presence? Had I taught my children that when difficulty arises, the first thing to look for is a solution, not a person? That realization did not break me. It only made me sit in silence longer. I began to understand that what was happening tonight was not a sudden betrayal by my children. It was the result of countless small choices, repeated over many years, choices in which I, too, bear my share of responsibility. That decision did not come from anger. It went on a tranquil night when I was sitting alone in my office on the top floor of the company building. The city below was still lit, but I no longer felt connected to it the way I once had. On the desk were familiar reports, numbers I had looked at for decades. For the first time, they no longer gave me a sense of certainty. That day, I received 3 phone calls. The first was from Evelyn. She spoke quickly, her voice edged with urgency. She needed money to address an urgent issue with the house. Before I could ask anything more, she said, "Mom, help me, please, just like every other time." The second call was from Thomas. My son spoke more slowly, more deliberately. An investment opportunity, he said, needing capital within a few weeks. His tone was calm, as if this were understood between us. The third call came later. It was Noah. He didn't mention money at all. He only asked whether I had been tired lately, whether work had been stressful. He reminded me to take care of myself, then hung up because he still had to prepare lessons for the next day. I put the phone down and sat there for a long time. It wasn't the first 2 calls that saddened me. I had long been accustomed to that. What held my gaze was the third call, brief and without any request. At that moment, I wasn't thinking about punishing anyone. I had no intention of proving anything. I only felt the need to see more clearly, to see, when there was no more money, no familiar role, who I was in my children's lives. I understood that if I kept intervening, kept arranging everything, I would never see the truth. I needed to step out of my position, even if only for a short while. So I decided to test it, not to catch anyone at fault, not to embarrass anyone, to observe, when everything is stripped away, what remains. I considered it very carefully. I arranged everything safely. I spoke with my lawyer, but asked him to remain absolutely silent. I didn't want anyone to know, and I didn't want an easy way back for myself. I believed that if I didn't interfere, if I didn't push things in the direction I preferred, then the truth would reveal itself in its own way, and when it did, whatever the outcome, I would be able to face it directly, without resentment, without deceiving myself again. I left my apartment early one morning. I carried nothing but a small bag with a few old sets of clothes. I chose items that drew as little attention as possible, things I would never wear without reason. When the elevator doors closed, I knew I had stepped out of a familiar role, even if only temporarily. The days that followed passed more slowly than I had expected. I walked a lot. I sat at bus stops, in parks, in places where people usually didn't linger. Some people looked at me and then looked away. Some avoided my eyes as if I didn't exist. Most didn't see me at all. I wasn't upset. I only observed. I began to understand what it feels like to be overlooked, not because people are cruel, but because they are accustomed to not looking. Everyone's life is complete, and what doesn't concern them is quickly pushed aside. One afternoon, I sat beside an older woman on a stone bench near the station. She had a worn cloth bag and rough hands. She handed me half of a stale loaf of bread, saying very little. We sat and ate in silence. Then she briefly mentioned that she had been living on the streets for nearly 3 years. Her children lived far away. They hadn't been in contact for a long time. I didn't ask more. I didn't know what to ask. When she stood up and left, I watched her go and felt something settle inside me. It wasn't pity. It was something else, like standing in front of a mirror I had never really looked into. At night, the cold sharpened my awareness. I curled up, listening as the sound of traffic gradually thinned. In that quiet, a question appeared, not loudly but very clearly. If one day I truly fell, unable to stand back up on my own, who would stay? I didn't let the question take me too far. I didn't allow myself to sink into fear. I left it there, like a stone placed in my chest, heavy enough to remember, but not heavy enough to crush me. Those days didn't make me resent society, nor did I pity myself. I learned to look at life more slowly, to look at people when they don't have to be kind, to look at myself without my familiar layers of protection. And in that stillness, I began to sense more clearly what was real and what only existed when everything was going well. I knew that whatever I was about to see in my children, no matter what it was, would be something that needed to be seen. Anna didn't block the doorway. She stepped aside and gently pulled me inside, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The door closed behind us, cutting me off from the cold outside. The house wasn't large. The furniture was old but tidy. There was the warm scent of food, the familiar smell of a simple dinner. Noah came out of the kitchen. He looked at me but didn't speak right away. His eyes lingered on my face, then on my hands, which were trembling slightly. "Sit down, Mom," he said. "Are you tired?" The question came before any others. Not why, not money, just my condition. Anna brought out a cup of warm water. She placed it in my hands and pulled a chair closer to the table. "Drink this first," she said. "We'll eat later." I nodded. No one looked at me as a problem to be solved. I was simply someone who needed to sit down. Dinner that night was effortless. A pot of vegetable soup, some rice, and a few slices of bread. Anna apologized that there wasn't more. I said it was fine, and it was the truth. I ate slowly, one spoonful at a time. No one rushed me. No one asked anything further. Noah talked about a few things at school, small, unimportant stories, as if to fill the silence, to keep the atmosphere ordinary. After the meal, Anna cleaned up. Noah brought me a thin blanket. "You can sleep on the sofa, Mom," he said. "We only have one bedroom." I was about to refuse, but Anna shook her head gently. "It's okay," she said. "We're used to it." That night, I lay on the old sofa. There was a dip in the middle of the cushion. The blanket wasn't thick, but it was warm enough. The TV in the living room played softly, then went silent. I heard water running in the kitchen, then light footsteps. The house was quiet in a way different from the quiet I was used to, not because it was large, but because there was nothing to hide. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't sleep yet. The walls were thin. Sound didn't stay contained. I heard Noah and Anna's voices from the kitchen. They spoke softly, but without secrecy. "Noah," Anna said, "we need to rethink our spending." "I know," Noah replied. His voice wasn't tense, just tired. "This month's salary is just enough." A pause. Then the sound of a drawer opening. I didn't look, but I knew it was the small drawer in the kitchen where they kept a few rare valuables. "Maybe we should sell the ring," Anna said. Her tone was calm, as if discussing a practical option rather than a great sacrifice. "Just temporarily." Noah didn't answer right away. "Your ring," he said. "You like it." "I like our marriage," Anna replied. "The ring is just an object. We'll be fine." I lay there, eyes open in the dark. There was no complaining, no blame, no dramatic tension, just two people weighing a possibility, very practical, very quiet. "Let's see how things look in a few days," Noah said. "No need to decide right now." Anna agreed. That was how the conversation ended. No grand promises, no pushing themselves to the limit. I turned my face toward the wall. The feeling inside me didn't surge. It spread slowly. I understood then that the kindness here wasn't blind sacrifice. They weren't throwing everything away. They were opening space for sharing within what they could bear. That small house didn't make me feel rescued. It made me think. And in that quiet kindness, I began to understand that some values don't need to be spoken loudly. They are clearly present when people choose to stay, even when they have very little to give. The next morning, I woke earlier than everyone else. The first light of day slipped through the thin curtains and spread across the small living room. Noah and Anna were still asleep. I sat quietly on the sofa, doing nothing. No calculating, no arranging, just sitting and breathing steadily. I knew very well what I could do. I knew I had the authority to decide. I could make a phone call, change everything in a single morning. That power had followed me for many years, so familiar that at times I didn't even realize I was using it reflexively. But at that moment, I didn't want to react. I watched Noah as he came out of the bedroom. He greeted me softly, then went to wash up, preparing for another workday like any other. Nothing in the way he moved suggested he was expecting anything from me. There was no impatience, no calculation. He was living his life, steady and composed. Anna came out shortly after. She brewed coffee and set a cup in front of me. "Drink it while it's warm," she said. Her voice remained calm. No probing, no hesitation, no change because of my presence. She did what needed to be done, as if I were a natural part of this morning. I observed them, not to judge, to see clearly. Noah's steadiness didn't come from everything going smoothly. It came from accepting his limits. Anna's calmness wasn't because she had no worries, but because she didn't allow worry to control her actions. In that moment, I understood that if I made any decision right then, it would carry emotions that had not yet settled. I had learned long enough to know that when the mind is still disturbed, even a correct action can leave a misalignment behind. So I paused, not because I was afraid, but because I respected the truth that was gradually emerging. I believed that when I didn't rush to intervene, what needed to be seen would reveal itself, and then I could choose, not from agitation, but from a quieter place within myself. My lawyer arrived on the third day. He came alone, without any outward display. His car stopped in front of the small house long enough for a few neighbors to look out curiously, then return to their own business. I didn't go out to greet him. I remained seated in my familiar chair and let Noah open the door. He greeted Noah and Anna very politely, as if they were the actual homeowners. That caught my attention. He didn't ask how I was doing. He looked at me and nodded slightly, as if understanding that this wasn't the moment for unnecessary words. Not long after, Evelyn and Thomas arrived as well. Evelyn entered first. She was still neat and well put together, her eyes scanning quickly around the small room. Thomas followed, his hand gripping his car keys tightly. Both of them looked tense. No one asked how long I had been there. No one asked if I was all right. They looked at me as if I were a situation that needed explaining. I gestured for everyone to sit down. The atmosphere in the room wasn't heavy, but it wasn't comfortable either. I waited for the lawyer to speak. He spoke slowly and clearly. The company was still operating normally. The assets had not disappeared. I had never gone bankrupt. Everything had been arranged deliberately within a limited period of time. Evelyn looked at me, her eyes widening. Thomas remained silent for a long while. I didn't look at them right away. I let the truth settle on its own, without forcing it. "This is not a trap," I said once everyone had had enough time to understand. My voice was neither raised nor cold. I didn't do this to humiliate anyone. I looked directly at my two older children. I did it because I needed to see clearly, and I needed you to look again as well. Evelyn started to say something, but I raised my hand gently. "Wait," I said. "Before you explain, I want to say my part." I said that I knew I had taught them a great deal about success, about protecting themselves, about not being at a disadvantage. I also said that I had not trained enough about how to stay when things became difficult. I admitted that I had grown used to solving everything with money and decision-making power rather than with presence. "I'm not standing here as someone who is entirely right," I said. "I have my share of responsibility in who you've become." Thomas lowered his head. Evelyn clasped her hands tightly. I didn't know what they were thinking. I didn't need to know yet. "I don't blame you for not recognizing me," I continued. "I'm only saddened that when you thought I was someone who had nothing left, you couldn't stay a little longer." No one argued. No one pushed back. That silence wasn't born of fear, but of there being no room left to say otherwise. "I didn't come here to punish anyone," I said, "nor to prove who is good or bad. I only want things to be placed where they belong." The lawyer closed the file. No documents were signed. No decisions were made at that moment. I didn't need to do anything further right then. The truth had been spoken, not to make anyone lose face, but so that everyone could see a straightforward thing. When benefit disappears, what remains? And each person would have to face their own answer, not before me, but before themselves. No one spoke for several minutes after that. The atmosphere in the room wasn't tense, but it wasn't light either. Each person seemed to be quietly rearranging what they had just heard, seen and understood in their own way. Noah was the first to speak. He didn't stand up. He sat a little straighter, his hands resting on his knees. His voice wasn't shaky, but it was slow. "I'm not angry," Noah said. "I think I'm used to it." Evelyn looked toward her younger brother. Thomas did the same. "I'm used to being seen as the lesser one," Noah continued. "Not because of money, but because I chose a different life. I know I'm not wealthy. I don't have the things people define as success, but that difference isn't what hurts me most." He paused for a second, as if searching for the words. "What hurts is the feeling that I always have to prove I'm not wrong, that I'm not a burden, that I haven't failed." The room fell silent. I didn't intervene. I knew this wasn't my moment. "Noah," Evelyn said softly, but he shook his head. "I'm not saying this to blame anyone," Noah went on. "I just want it said clearly, so that from now on, if we still call each other family, no one has to stand below anyone else." Anna stood up. She didn't step into the center of the room. She stood beside Noah. Her voice was quiet but clear. "I don't think anyone meant to do harm," Anna said. "I think everyone is used to measuring value by what's easy to see, houses, cars, jobs. But some things don't show themselves right away." She looked at Evelyn, then at Thomas. Not sharply, not sarcastically. "When you knocked on the door, what mattered wasn't who you were," Anna said. "It was what you needed. If at that moment you had truly been a stranger, the reaction would still have been a real one." Evelyn lowered her head. Her hands were intertwined. I saw fear there. Not the fear of losing money, but the fear of facing an image she had never wanted to recognize. "I didn't think it would turn out like this," Evelyn said. Her voice was hoarse. "I've grown used to protecting my life. I'm afraid of trouble. I'm afraid of things going beyond my control." Thomas took a deep breath. "Me too," he said. "I thought I was being reasonable, but now looking back, I'm not so sure." I listened. None of them said they had changed. None of them made promises. There was only acknowledgement mixed with worry and regret, and I understood that for now it was enough. No one won this dialogue. No one lost. There were only things finally spoken, late but necessary. Pains that had long been ignored were now named, not to close everything immediately, but to begin differently, if everyone truly wished to. I waited until the room had fully settled before speaking, not to deliver a verdict, but to return everything to its proper place. "I will not change my will today," I said. My voice was steady, neither rigid nor overly gentle. Not because I haven't seen enough, but because I don't want to make a long-term decision in an emotional moment. Evelyn let out a quiet breath of relief. Thomas lifted his head. I noticed their reactions, but I did not allow them to guide me. But starting today, I continued, I will no longer provide financial support the way I did before. No one objected. Perhaps they had expected it. I'm not doing this to punish you, I said plainly, and it's not to leave you lacking. You all have your own lives and the ability to take care of yourselves. I only want to stop a habit that has gone on for far too long. I turned toward the lawyer, then back to my children. If we still want to call each other family, then that relationship cannot continue to be built on money. It needs to be rebuilt on other things. I spoke slowly, allowing each sentence to stand on its own. What I'm hoping for isn't a hurried apology, nor promises meant to reassure me. I need time, and I need to see lasting change, not over a few weeks, but in the way you show up for one another. I looked at Noah and Anna, then back to Evelyn and Thomas. Not because of money, I emphasized, but because of the relationship, because of how we treat each other when there is no benefit attached. I didn't lay out a long list of demands. I didn't impose rigid conditions. I said only one final thing. If you want to keep a place in my life, then begin by staying. Stay for visits without a reason. Stay when there is nothing to ask for. Stay when all that's needed is listening. No one responded right away, but I knew that decision did not close any doors. It only stopped nourishing relationships built the wrong way, and that, to me, was a step that was fair, clear-minded, and humane enough. I stayed in Noah and Anna's small house for a few more days, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I needed time for everything to settle. There, I was no longer the one who had to make constant decisions. I was simply a mother drinking morning coffee, helping fold laundry, and watering a few potted plants on the porch. Life moved more slowly there. No one asked me what important thing I would do that day. No one expected me to fix anything. In the evenings, we ate together. Sometimes we talked. Sometimes we just sat quietly. I realized I had been accustomed for far too long to controlling everything, to the point of forgetting what it felt like to be in a space that demanded nothing. One afternoon, I sat alone on the sofa, watching sunlight stream through the window. I thought about the doors that had closed in front of me, about standing outside Evelyn's porch, about the cash in my hand from Thomas. It no longer hurt the way it once had, not because everything was resolved, but because I no longer needed to prove anything. I understood something very clearly. Money can buy many things, but it cannot buy a door that opens when you are at your weakest. It cannot buy a simple question about your health. It cannot purchase unconditional presence. In these past days, I didn't try to find answers about who was right or wrong. I didn't arrange for anyone to pay a price. I let things follow their own course, and in that non-interference, I felt lighter. Cause and effect do not need humans to push them forward. They operate when each person honestly faces their own choices. Not always quickly, not always clearly, but they arrive most fittingly. When the mind is clear enough, I realize I don't need to win against anyone. I only need not to lose myself, not to let pain lead the way, not to let disappointment turn into bitterness. I watched Noah fixing a wobbly bookshelf. I watched Anna place a few more flowers into an old vase. In that moment, I saw a different kind of wealth, quiet and more enduring than any number I had ever owned. The road ahead with Evelyn and Thomas still holds many uncertainties, but I am no longer afraid. I have found a place where I can set my heart down, and from there, I know that no matter how things change, I will move forward with a more peaceful state of mind. No need to win, just to be right with myself. And when I am right with myself, everything else will find its proper place.